On Ash Wednesday, we began our annual Lenten journey with a smudge of ashes on our foreheads and a litany of penitence. We declared before God that the beginning of our journey must include our confession that we are mortal, limited, and weak, and that we are sinners. The task of our journey is to go inward now along the path, to go inward into our souls, into our thoughts and behaviors, to come to grips with who we really are, honestly, truly. Jesus is our model for entering into this wilderness experience. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is driven into the wilderness for a 40-day period of self-examination and prayer in silence and solitude. To focus his attention on the task and on God the Father, he fasts. Without food to sustain his energy, he depends entirely on the love of God. There are countless Lenten disciplines that we can voluntarily give up or take on. Some will give up coffee, sweets, or meat, for instance, and others may take on the Stations of the Cross, the daily prayer office, or almsgiving to the poor. In taking on Lenten disciplines, we are training ourselves to be attentive to God, the giver, rather than the gifts that he gives. For instance, if I decide to give up chocolate for Lent, then I am saying that I like chocolate a lot. And not having any reminds me that God is the source and I love him more than it. We're also training ourselves for those times in our lives, call it adversity, change, or challenge, when we're called upon to endure the unexpected loss of one of God's gifts to us. Lenten discipline prepares us for adversity, not first and foremost by teaching us how to do without, but to train us to depend upon God, to lean on God in all life's circumstances. Lent is not about the outward things, these tools, or the disciplines themselves, but about the interior work of the soul. Jesus enters the wilderness and goes inward into his soul to reckon with the meaning of his baptism and the purpose of his life. Recall that Jesus had just been baptized by John before going on his wilderness retreat. He was deeply focused on himself and himself in relation to his Father in heaven. This is vitally important. Jesus took responsibility for himself. Before he could take on his mission to save the world, he had to reckon with himself. The Reverend Dr. Peter Stinky, I apologize, Dr. Stinky. Stink, stank, stunk. I just can't say it right. But Dr. Pete, whose work on family systems theory we're going to be exploring in detail next Sunday, calls this the stewardship of the self. In Mark's version of Jesus' wilderness experience, we do not get the details of his temptation by Satan as we do in the other Gospels, but it was his response to Satan's temptation, which was a crucible, a trial, a test, that solidified his character and purpose. It is there in the wilderness that Jesus understood his ultimate purpose to deal with the sin of the world. To deal with sin, he would have to take all the sin of the world upon himself and then to be killed in a kind of perversion for the one without sin. God's only Son would have to die an excruciating death at the hands of unrepentant sinners. A grotesque irony. Unrepentant sinners for whom absolute goodness is a threat to be eliminated. Jesus' rejection of Satan's temptations, his temptations for Jesus to wriggle out of his destiny, to avoid that awful suffering and death, clarifies and carves out the deep outlines of his divine character. When we enter into a serious Lenten season, when we commit to stewardship of self, we are spiritually joined to Christ, and we are distinctively counterculture in doing this. The fashionable thing is to look outward from the self, to look at others and to judge them, to spend our energy finding faults in other people, watching and scrutinizing others to find their flaws. And then the blaming and the gossip and the judgments become the subject of our conversations. They become the subject of our conversations and the thoughts of our hearts. That pattern of looking outward rather than inward, more often than not, leads us to see ourselves as superior. At least I'm not like so-and-so. And that leads to self-satisfaction and hubris. Indeed, that is Satan's temptation to us, which we must reject. Go inward. In order for our Christian character to grow, for us to become our truest and best selves, we must turn inward into ourselves. We do this in a wilderness of solitude and prayer by examining and acknowledging the realities of our life and then pleading for help. It is there, deep inside ourselves, in honest dialogue with God, where we meet and receive true forgiveness. And what a blessed release that is. The burden of our sins lifted off our backs and our spirits renewed and lightened. It is in the wilderness that the depths of God's love is poured out into our broken and contrite hearts. It is there where the deep outlines of our individual Christian characters are carved into our souls. We can breathe again. We understand our purpose anew. It is not a coincidence that our readings today are saturated with baptismal imagery. 1 Peter says that the Genesis flood, which was God's judgment on an evil and violent world, prefigured baptism. To be baptized is to be put on the ark and to be lifted up. And so we must turn to our baptism to guide our confession along our journey. As we examine ourselves this Lenten season, we should include an honest appraisal of how we have lived the life that we promised to live, the life that we were baptized into. These questions, we're going to do this again. Instead of the creed, we're going to do the baptismal covenant. But these questions, are we continuing in fellowship, study, and prayers with other Christians? Are we resisting evil and repenting regularly? Are we proclaiming by word and example the good news of Jesus Christ to other people? Are we seeking and serving Christ in all persons, including those who don't seem to deserve it? Are we striving for justice and peace, upholding the dignity of every human being? Every human being. And these, though we will answer them yes, they are not yes-no questions. They're questions that should lead us inward. They should lead us into memories of the people and the circumstances and situations in which we have acted or failed to act. We can name those. It may all sound daunting, even scary, to enter into wilderness work. St. Augustine said, "Our life in this sojourn cannot be without trial, because our advance, read in that, our spiritual maturity, is made through our trials, and no one can be known to himself unless tested." So it is work. And in all of it, remember this, that Christ will be with you there in the wilderness, and his angels will serve you too. I pray yours is a holy and wholly worthwhile Lent.